Edward Kemper, the co-ed killer Edward Kemper, a serial killer and necrophiliac, was born on December 18, 1944 in Burin, California to father Edward Kemper, an ex-veteran from World War II, and mother Carnal. The marriage was toxic. Carnal was a very nasty piece of work. She would look down her nose at her husband and tell him he was no good and no one would want him. When she gave birth to Edmund, she refused to cuddle him as it might make him gay. When Ed started school, he had a mad crush on his teacher, and he would follow her home with an old war knife in his pocket, and he would watch her every move she made until she got in. In 1957, his father left Carnal, saying he couldn't put up with Carnal anymore. This really upset Ed, being left with his evil mother. She would start calling Ed names the same as she did to his dad. She also made Ed sleep in a locked basement. The only light he had was light from the furnace. If he cried, his mother would slap him and say, "Man up." At this time, Ed started to have dark thoughts. He would take his sister's dolls and cut their heads off. When he was a youngster, he went to a magic show at a comic book store, where he saw a magician cut a girl's head off. Of course it was just a trick, she didn't die, but Ed was fascinated with the guillotine and how it cut off heads. Sometime later he got hold of the house cat and buried it in the backyard alive. He stabbed another to death and buried it in the yard. His mother found them. Ed was 6 feet tall, and his mother said she was scared of him. That's why she locked him in the basement. She started telling him no girl would ever want anything to do with him. She would say after dinner she was going to give him a good thrashing when he was finished. His mother also an alcoholic, and Ed couldn't put up with her anymore, so he decided to leave home and run away to find his father in California. Ed found his dad, but his dad had a new life and a new family. His father's wife said that because of stress Ed had to go, so Ed's father took his new family and Ed to spend Christmas with his mother and father. Young Ed's grandparents, when Christmas was over, Ed's father along with his new family up and left without Ed. They also changed their phone numbers so he couldn't contact them, so Ed stayed his grandparents. His grandfather gave Ed a gun to shoot small animals around the farm. At this time Ed had a lot of rage inside him, and he thought his grandmother was just like mother. On the 27th of August 1964, he was with her in the kitchen. He went to his room and got his back, shot her in the back of the head 3 times. His grandfather had just came back from the store. Ed walked through the back doors and shot him in the face 3 times so his grandfather wouldn't see his wife dead. Then Ed went back inside and phoned his mother and told her he had done. She told him to phone the police or she would, so he phoned the police. They came and arrested him. When asked why he did it, he said to see what it felt like, so he was handed over to the California Youth Authority. They tested his IG, it was very high. Ed was over the moon with it. He had a big head, saying he was a genius for days. He also diagnosed with paranoid psychotic. He was sent to a covenant for criminals. In 1959 he was released and his criminal record was done away with, never to be seen again. It was said that under no circumstances should Ed be released to his mother. It would cause a lot of problems. He did stay with a friend for a while, but when he ran out of money he went back to his mother, who recently moved to Santa Cruz for a job at the University of California. Ed still had check-in appointments with psychological groups and psychiatrists, but he was doing alright. He applied to the police force for a job, but he was too tall, being about 6 feet tall, so he worked a few different jobs. He then got a lorry driver job in 1971 for the Department of Transportation. However, Ed really wanted to be a police officer. He would go to a bar where they all went. They nicknamed him Big Head. He brought himself a motorcycle. While out one day, he was hit by a car and his arm was very damaged. He got an out-of-court settlement of $1,500. He went out and brought a car that resembled an undercover police car. At this time he didn't know what to do with his day. He couldn't work because of his arm injury, so he drove about and he noticed there was a lot of hitchhikers on campus, girls trying to get home, so he started to give them lifts. At first he would let them go alive, but one day he picked up 2 girls, Mary and Anita, who were trying to hitch home from school. Unfortunately the 18-year-olds didn't make it. He turned off the main road to a secluded place. When the girls noticed, they went into raging fits. Ed told them to shut up. He wasn't going to hurt or rape them. They wouldn't listen, so Ed decided to separate them. So he took hold of Anita and put her in the boot of the car. He then went back to Mary and he tried to strangle her. That didn't work, so he stabbed her to death. Then he went back to Anita. He opened the trunk and said, "I'm not going to hurt you." As he stood in front of her with blood all over him, he said, "Your friend got loud." Anita was screaming, trying to get away. He took his knife and stabbed her to death. Then he put the 2 girls in the trunk and drove off. He was stopped by the police for a broken tail light. As the police looked around the car, he said, "You can open the trunk if you'd like." "No, it's okay," said the police and went on his way. When Ed got home, he took the two bodies inside with him. He cut off their heads and hands. After having sex with them, he hid them in the cupboard for when he wanted sex again. In a wooded area, a head was found on the 15th of August, and unfortunately it was Mary Ann's. Anita's body was never found. September 1972, Ed picked up 15-year-old Heike. After a while she realized what Ed was up to and she tried to escape. He got hold of her and taped her mouth shut and putting his fingers up her nostrils tried to suffocate her. When that didn't work, he took a scarf from around her neck and strangled her with it. He then raped her corpse and threw her in the trunk of his car. Then Ed went for a drink with his friends at the police hangout. He then takes her back to his place and takes her head and hands off. He then proceeded to put them in a bag and took them with him when he went out to a court meeting. He then got rid of them. January 1973, he picked up another hiker named Cindy. He shot and killed her. Then, as normal for him, he took her home, dismembered her body and hid her in the closet. The next day he took her core pieces and threw them into the ocean. Her head he buried in the backyard looking up at his mother's window. On the 5th of February 1973, Ed and his mother gets into an argument. Ed goes out in his car and picks up two hikers from Compass, Rosalind and Alice. He drove a little way and then he shot Rosalind several times and then Alice. Then he pulled over in a cul-de-sac. He places the bodies in the trunk. He then took off their heads and hands. He also took the bullets from their heads. Then he got rid of their body parts in different locations. At this time there were two other murders in the area, giving Santa Cruz the name of murder capital of the world. Ed was known as the co-ed killer or butcher by the press. April 1973, on Good Friday, Ed and his mother had a bad argument. He waited until she went to sleep and beat her to death with a claw hammer. As with the others, he cut off her head and hands. He then messed about with her core and had oral sex with her head. Then he placed it on the mantle and used it as a dartboard. He invited his mother's friend Sally over for dinner. As soon as she came in, he strangled her, cut her up, put he in the cupboard and had sex with her later that night. He then took Sally's car and drove a few miles. Then he got a rented car and continuously drove until he reached Colorado. Ed then handed himself into the police after he phoned Santa Cruz police and told them he was the co-ed killer. They thought it was a joke. They knew him as Big Ed. The Colorado police handed him over to the California police. In April 1973, Ed was arrested and charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. In November 1973, he received 8 concurrent life sentences. He's serving his time in California Medical Facility. He's up for parole in 2017, but the parole board denied the request.